Welcome to this session of the Manchester Wesley Research Center at the American Academy of Religion. And I'm Jordan Hammond, the director of the Wesley Center, which is a related scholarly organization of AAR. And this has led us to hosting this session here this year. This is the fourth year running that we've done this. The Manchester Wesley Research Center was established in 2003, and it's a partnership of institutions and community of scholars who are working together to promote research in the Methodist, Wesleyan, and evangelical traditions. So it serves as a resource for students, for scholars, for the church, and particularly for the 16 MWRC partner institutions. In this setting, I particularly want to highlight two things. One, all of our public lectures, like the annual lecture we have each June, is live streamed and recorded, so it's available to everyone. And we regularly welcome visiting research fellows to Manchester for a period of research. And so the three scholars that you will see present today are all former visiting research fellows, and they will be sharing their research. So if you want to know more about the center, do get in touch with me, there's a lot of information on the MWRC website. So the title of this session is Global British Methodism and Nonconformity in the 19th and the early 20th centuries. To give you a brief overview, the first presentation will focus on increasing global awareness in British Methodist hymn books published in the 19th century. The second presentation is a case study of the theological convictions on liberty and justice of 6 persecuted Methodist agricultural laborers who founded one of the first British trade unions in 1833. And the final presentation will look at and explore Methodist and wider nonconformist efforts to aid persecuted Ottoman Armenians in the later 19th and early 20th centuries. So collectively, these presentations are an illustration of the wide range of research possibilities on Methodism that may be undertaken utilizing resources in the United Kingdom, particularly in Manchester at the John Rylands Library, where the Methodist Archives and Research Center is located. We turn now to our second presenter of this session, who is Ulrike Schuler, and she is professor of church history, Methodism, and Ecumenism at Reutlingen School of Theology, which is a theological school of the United Methodist Church in Germany. She's published many articles on European Methodism and Ecumenism. Her recent book, which she co-edited with Paul Chilcote and authored several of the chapters, is Women Pioneers in Continental European Methodism, 1689 to 1939. And this was published in the Routledge Methodist Studies series. So the title of her paper today is Liberty and Responsibility in the Spirit of Wesley, a case study of Methodist agricultural laborers in the 19th century. Thanks, Ulrike.
Thank you for the introduction. This presentation sheds light on the faithful actions of Methodist agricultural laborers who found one of the first British trade unions in 1833. 6 of them, 5 Methodists, 3 of whom were local preachers, were convicted of taking an unlawful oath that had sealed their trade union's membership. They were sentenced to 7 years transportation to Australia. The immediate public outcry eventually led to a full pardon being granted 3 years later. I want to make it clear with few examples how far their liberating faith determined their actions throughout their lives, and this in a convincing and witnessing way. Essentially, I will refer here to George Loveless, the spokesman of the Tolpuddle martyrs, as these condemned farm laborers are popularly remembered today. The focus on Loveless will demonstrate the laborers' Wesleyan understanding of God's liberating grace that gave wings to his actions and commitment to social and religious liberty and justice. Unfortunately, this will not be the time to expand on John Wesley's understanding through his sermons and statements, as I was able to do in my articles. But at least something of Wesley's understanding should become apparent for skilled theologians. Now here a short look at George Loveless' faithful life in exemplary scenes that underpin my theory. The Loveless family was one of the founding members of the small Wesleyan Methodist community in Tolpuddle. The paternal house of George Loveless was licensed as a dissenters' meeting house for religious worship and assemblies and persons teach or preaching therein. Loveless grew up in a pious and religiously ambitious home. After house meetings at the Loveless family's homes, the growing community built a chapel in Tolpuddle in 1818. It was recently archaeologically proven that this small chapel was built by hand by the agricultural workers. Two of the Tolpuddle martyrs were trustees, and two, among them George Loveless, local preachers of this chapel. A local article of that time shows a hostile mob of the villagers against Methodists, although they were faithful members of the Church of England and received the sacraments in the parish church. The Methodist movement in Great Britain arguably still remained with the established church as a renewal movement, but the relationship between the Church of England and the Methodists was quite ambiguous. The sources make it clear that these prejudices against the Methodists and their lay-led initiative to act in accordance with their scriptural understanding in public speaking ultimately had a significant influence on their condemnation. The establishment was skeptical about their loyalty. The chapel seemed to have been under observation and its members disadvantaged in society. When the wages of the agricultural workers were pushed further and further and slipped below the minimum income level, George Loveless, as elected spokesman for the agricultural workers, sought assistance from the Justice of Peace. He received the response that there was no law to force landowners to pay. As wages continued to drop, Loveless and a few colleagues were searching for a remedy. Loveless had heard of a trade union from his elder brother John, a flax dresser by trade, who had become a member of the Flax Dressers Trade Union of Leeds. He sent George information on how to proceed and a copy of the rules. George asked for professional support at the newly formed union headquarters, the Grand National Consolidated Trade Union, founded in London in 1833. Two delegates paid them a visit and encouraged them to set up a union to represent local agricultural workers' interests. So George and James Loveless, father and son, Thomas Stanfield and George Romaine, all four Methodist local preachers, assembled and founded a Friendly Society of Agricultural Laborers in Tolpuddle. Friendly Society basically provided financial benefits for unemployment, sickness, old age, accident, and death. The workers typically paid a shilling to become a member and a penny a week to support needy workers, a kind of self-help group of the agricultural laborers. I will not go into the course of the indictment that followed this foundation, nor the trial and sentencing, as I am concerned here with the basic spiritual attitude of the condemned. A short statement of George Loveless written to the judge presents a man who appears honestly to reveal the reasons for his actions and publicly apologizes for any unconscious misconduct. Nevertheless, the 6 agricultural laborers were sentenced to 7 years of forced labor in Australia. When the convicts were leaving the trial chained to each other, Loveless threw a note that he just had written to those waiting in front of the court. There he disclosed his principles and hopes in verses. God is our guide. From field, from wave, from plug, from anvil and from loom, we come our country's rights to save and speak a tyrant faction's doom. We raise the watchword liberty. We will be free. God is our guide. No sword we draw. We kindle not war's battle fires. We reason by reason, union, justice, law. We claim the birthright of our sires. We raise the watchword liberty. We will be free. The note was immediately intercepted and handed over to the court as further proof of an offense. These lines indicate Loveless' Christian motivation, a revelation of the living faith within him. The note provides evidence of Loveless' Christian way of life, which can be confirmed by looking at his life as a whole. He was aware of the liberty that is rooted in God's providence and that was leading him to nonviolent resistance. Such guidance also led him to the commitment to justice through reason, law, and fellowship with workers, an interest group that seeks to protect and preserve the rights of the country. He found there many of his religious brethren. The Methodist societies and trade unions had overlapping memberships. Liberty was also based on the birthright of his forefathers, which he confidently demanded. The password is used to specify the goal, liberty. This appeal, repeated 3 times at the end of each stanza, shows penetrating and inspiring willpower and the confidence to achieve the goal of being holistically free as God intended. The mental freedom was manifested during the forced labor in Australia, where Loveless managed to win the favor of his employer through reliable and careful work. He received the privilege to be allowed to read the employer's newspaper. In this way, Loveless heard about his full pardon and those of his fellow convicts. Since all of them had been assigned to work in Australia, scattered far and wide, he sought out the others and informed them about their acquittal and also about their free return trip, which was approved by the king. By the way, the governor in Australia had been informed officially, but had not forwarded the notification to the ones concerned. Finally, all 6 returned after about 4 years as free men to Great Britain. The London Dorchester Committee of the Trade Union had sustained the wives and families during the absence of their bread earners. They had also raised a fund on their behalf. Fellow workmen had collected money to provide the returnees with farm of their own in Essex, leased for 7 years. 5 of them, among George Loveless, moved there. Beside working their farms, Loveless and his companions continued to campaign for workers' rights, now in the Chartist movement. The meeting of a newly formed Chartist association were held at Loveless' home. They were active in making known the People's Charter of 1838 that targeted 6 reforms, including acting against political corruption, claiming democracy on an industrial society, and opposing wage cuts and unemployment. That became again a subject of complaint of the vicar of their parish to the bench of magistrates. It seems the laborers did not really gain a foothold in their own homes and were met with prejudice, not the least from the vicar, who also complained that now a number of dissenters had infiltrated his parish. They eventually emigrated to Canada, where most of them became farmers and were actively involved in church and society. George Loveless helped build a church where he preached, held Bible classes and Sunday school lessons. Hereinafter are some aspects of an open letter entitled "The Church Shown Up" that George Loveless wrote to the Reverend Henry Walter, vicar of Halsbury Bryant in Dorset. It illustrates the range of his social and interdenominational themes and insights of his devout, sincere, straightforward, and astute attitude. In this letter, Loveless unveiled the motive for his action: the duty to follow his conscience as a Christian, to expose undesirable developments to public view, and to stand up for just living conditions. The letter was written following his public denunciation by some clergy. Reverend Walter had referred to Loveless as a strife maker and peace breaker, wicked man and criminal, even appealing to the president of the Wesleyan conference to intervene. So Loveless felt compelled to respond to his character assassination. His explanation focused less on his own behavior than on the role of the Church of England and the example presented by the ministers, especially in their relationship with workers. Loveless' maxim was, as he stated, freedom and conscience, a birthright of all people. Since the Almighty Creator had blessed him and others with the power of thought and judgment, he owed it to his fellow laborers to use these dutiful and to speak freely about truth and righteousness. Here it became again very clear how Loveless placed his actions within the context of the concept of Christian liberty and responsibility to which he was committed. Looking at the Church of England, Loveless stated that its character appears of the blackest description. According to this, his own experience, the representatives of the Church of England did not follow God's commandments or the Sermon on the Mount, which he cited in clear contrast to their behavior. The Church was not on the side of the needy but of the powerful, a fact he substantiated by referring to specific events. The brutal persecution of the Society of Friends, other dissenters and Catholics were cited as example of church authorities siding with the powerful. Loveless testified, "I thought it criminal to persecute any man for conscience sake, and also men different in religious opinions. I did not see why that should make them worse citizens or less loyal and dutiful subjects." This is reminiscent of John Wesley's sermon, Catholic Spirit, and is always also evocative of Wesley and the breadth of his understanding of liberty and justice for all. Loveless mentions further striking unbiblical inconsistencies of the established church and their representatives. The obvious fear of losing influence, power, and participation in the prosperity of the powerful nation. The practice such as requiring church membership as the condition of offering trade and employment. The refusal of the majority of the clergy to vote for the 1833 Reform Act, which gave many more people the right to vote. The rule to give 10% of the lands produced to clergymen in return for no obvious benefit. Loveless described his lack of understanding of alleged church teachings on baptism and burial. So he asked for exemplation of the legitimacy of the teaching that baptism that unbaptized children were not a human being, but a thing, and of the church denying everlasting peace to people who were not buried in consecrated ground. He posed the question of how far the belief in God's omnipresence extended in view of such practices. He finished his letter: "In conclusion, sir, I would assure you that from the Bible may be extracted all those principles of morality and justice, the practice of which would increase the happiness of mankind, and that it will rise above all opposition, enlightening the faith, enlivening the hope, enlarging the charity, enkindling the love, upholding the zeal, and direction the conduct of man until the end of time, that our country may be preserved in peace and prosperity, the people increase in knowledge and advance in happiness, and the nations of the earth look on each other with friendship and affection, is the sincere wish of, sir, yours respectfully, George Loveless." George Loveless came from a poor farm worker's family and was self-taught. He and his brother acquired basic knowledge of reading and writing in their Methodist Sunday school. And in the evening, after a long stretch of physical work in the fields, they continued their education unerringly and purposefully. The surprising extent of Loveless' self-education can be seen in the rhetorical skill and social political understanding displayed in his letter to the Reverend Henry Walter. His arguments were ingenious, and the examples he quoted revealed profound knowledge of the biblical, ecclesiastical, social, and political realms. He demonstrated understanding of the needs, experiences, and concerns of the needy people of his social class. Also noteworthy was the ecumenical breadth of his vision, which sought freedom for others to enjoy liberty of thought and speech. Whether he knew John Wesley's sermon, The Catholic Spirit, or any other writing of Wesley is not proven, but can be presumed since he argued on similar lines. And in addition, Methodist local preachers, as he was one, had basic Wesleyan teaching texts for self-study. Loveless contrasted the church representative's actions with the witness of the Bible and his understanding of God's creation, justice, and truth. His conclusions are consistent. The misguided and abandoned could only overcome their weakness, exhaustion, hunger, and misery when they begin to question their values and free themselves from mental and political slavery. The working class has to recognize the purpose that God intends for them, to educate themselves and to act responsibly as individuals for the benefit of all. Wesley described in several writings that from the perspective of those who believe in God, the main characteristic of the human relationship to God is the ability to act morally. This is what we get with George Loveless' attitude. Loveless, an experienced local preacher, routinely combined faith and praxis in everyday life, heart, hand, and mind. When accused and defamed as he was, he did not focus his response on himself, but saw himself as part of a social group in a community of wage earners and Christians for whom he faced criticism, which he in turn read in a social and religious context. In the name of the creator of the world, he claimed the gift of liberty for all. To the Christian believer, the history of Tolpadel martyrs show vividly how liberty, rooted in the love of God, is unfolded in a relationship with God, and as part of a community, it takes concrete shape as living grace. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ulrike. So anyone who is with us, any of the attendees, you are welcome to type in a question in the chat feature, and we will address as many of them as we have time for. So are there anyone who would like to start with a question?
I have a question. Thank you very much, Ulrike. A fascinating topic. You mentioned how his criticism was directed towards the established church, the Church of England, and that in response, I think you mentioned a vicar then wrote to or appealed to the president of the conference to kind of rein in George Loveless. Did he? What was the response of the Methodist hierarchy to his agitations, his involvement in this movement? And did he ever criticize the Methodist hierarchy for similar things?
Mm-hmm. That is a very interesting question, and I tried to find out what the conference maybe has answered. It is not proved that really the conference or the president of the conference ever received such a letter. And also, if you look at the minutes of the Wesleyan Methodists, I went through several years. There is nothing written about this. There's also nothing written about the story of them. But it was true at that time that the Wesleyan Methodists very much supported the poor people and the needy persons. But it was also true that there was a regulation and a rule that political work was not allowed. So it was a little bit a difficult situation. They stood in between, and it seems that there is not a written source about it that we can find. But on the other hand, I cannot believe that nobody supported them. But it is also interesting that there are only very few from the Wesleyan Methodists, more from the Protestant Methodists. They were very political, active, and also in the trade union, active there. So it's as a source, give no answer to this. I don't know. There is once someone wrote described the story and also what happened to these Tolpaddle martyrs and so on. And he wrote that there was a letter to the president and how he reacted and so on. But 10 years later, when this book was revised, he said, yes, that is not true what he wrote. It was a fiction, but he could not think that nothing has happened. So that he made a story of this. But this was funny, and people there were citations about this in other books, but the story was not correct.
Thank you.
Maybe David, I can show you now if this picture, can you see this? Did I share this or not?
No.
No, that did not work, okay.
So you hit the share screen. Did you try to get in the share screen?
I try, okay. Here it is. I wanted to show you this because it is
it's there now.
Yeah. So see this now. It's much better. This is a sculpture about the Tolpaddle martyrs, and this is in Tolpaddle. And I think that it is this person who portrayed John Loveless here did this very sensitive. I like this very much. I like the pose. The pose shows both exhaustion and devotion. both on the same side. And he is upright, facing upwards from where help is requested and expected. Maybe he's in prayer posture, with a firm grip on the ground and firmly supported by one hand, the left hand, and with the other hand is resolutely clenched in a fist. And maybe you can see this much better here. On the left picture, you see a little bit, can see this, how he is doing this. So it's the whole person is very much characterized in this sculpture in Tolpadel.
Thanks. I think David has a question.
I do. You mentioned the agitation that took place after the sentencing that resulted in the pardon. Do you have any sense of who organized the resistance, who participated, and who made the decisions finally?
Yes, there was a person who was also in the parliament, who later on brought also questions to the parliament, but there was a huge outcry, what I wrote said in the beginning, of people who organized this. I think the people also in the surrounding were very much informed. There was daily something written in the newspaper about this very fast trial, what happened, and also these newspapers brought details and informed people. And that was the reason then that I think it must have been the trade unions who organized the workers to do this big march to the parliament. Mm-hmm. This is very well described. So the whole story is not in the Methodist history so much explained, and it was also about 100 years later. When the trade union remembered this as the first trade union, and they did some research, and it was interesting that a researcher went to Canada to find out more about this, and then it became sure that these people who were convicted and were in Australia, they had decided when they went to Canada not to talk about this story anymore. They didn't speak in public about this, and also their children had no idea about this horrible events. And this reporter, this journalist, he because of his questions, it came to light. And then he wrote an article about this, and also there is a big book from the trade unions who explain all this, what has happened, but not in Methodist history. And it is maybe because there was a shame, and it was a difficult situation between the Church of England and this movement, not still officially. I think this, but also in the Manchester, there is a museum, the Trade Union Museum.
Yes. Yeah.
That is also, the story is there, but nothing about their religious background. There is nothing written about that. No. Mm-hmm. So it is a a fascinating story. And I think I'm looking forward. I was one in Tolpadel, and there is where the little chapel has been. They are working on this, and they want to make this a spirit. It's an ecumenical project. They want to make there a spiritual center to remember also the hard work of agricultural workers, and also of the role of the Church of England. And the Church of England also, there was an excuse once officially about their behavior at that time. So this is all in progress, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you very much, Ulrike. And I should say that if you want more about this, 2 articles relating to the Tolpuddle martyrs have been published in the journal Wesley and Methodist Studies. So I encourage you to have a look at those. Thanks very much.
Thank you.